Let's bring in Zeke Miller and Tara Palmeri now. Zeke is a CBSN political contributor and covers the White House for Time, and Tara is a White House correspondent for Politico. So much happening in Washington this week, but how is that unlike the entire Trump presidency? Let me just start by asking you about this battle for Gorsuch and the Supreme Court, because the consensus seems to be that he will be nominated eventually, one way or another. But in order to get there, the Senate is willing, Republican senators willing to change filibuster rules. Are we looking at, Zeke, I'll start with you, a fundamental change to the role the Senate could play? Might it lose its bipartisan edge over the House, which seems more.
Yeah, I mean, that old metaphor that we all learned in school, that the Senate is like that saucer that cools the hot cup of tea. That's maybe about to go out the window. I was talking to one Republican lawmaker last week who said the Senate could become, a 6-year House term where, everything is done in 51 votes. Right now, even, yes, the Democrats went nuclear during the Obama years on most judicial appointments and left, so the run-of-the-mill appellate court judge got through with 51 votes instead of 60, but they left that in place for the Supreme Court. That is almost certainly going to crumble this week. And then, but the next step would be legislation. That could happen next. That means everything in the Senate could start happening on 51 votes. And what that creates is, it's no longer a moderating force on the House. Mm-hmm. And that's why this, in a lot of ways, is a very short-sighted play by Democrats. They're taking advantage of this broader, popular displeasure with the president right now. And yes, that is a smart political play today. But tomorrow, or in 2 years from now, when the next Supreme Court nominee comes up, they're giving up a whole lot of leverage, and that could be a very big problem for Democrats, and will really change the dynamic in Washington for the long term.
And Tara, Democrats will say essentially they're stuck between delivering on what their constituents want, which they say is to resist whatever President Trump does. But at the same time, they're now laying the groundwork for Republicans to be able to get through Supreme Court nominees, and there are likely to be more within the Trump administration with only a simple majority. What are you hearing from people as far as what this week means?
I think this means that in the future you're going to see even more partisan picks for Supreme Court justices, which may be an issue even further down the line for Democrats, because if the Republicans know that they can push through a Supreme Court nominee with a simple majority, their next pick probably will be less mainstream than Neil Gorsuch. And you're going to see the same from Democrats as well. So I think that we should all be concerned that politics in general will become way more partisan, and it may add just the divisiveness that you've been seeing in our country and create a situation where they really just can't work.
So why do you feel that Democrats see this as their best option? Is it because it is their only option? I mean, why not allow Gorsuch to go through typical, congressional parliamentary means, if you want to use that expression, and then wait until the next Supreme Court nominee for the big fight, which is, as you mentioned, likely to actually tip the court in either direction? Because at this moment, Gorsuch is taking the seat of a conservative justice who passed away, Antonin Scalia. It's restoring the court. Why don't Democrats see the long game here?
Well, I mean, it seems to be they're just not looking at it. They're seeing the short-term political gain, sort of the desire to to feed into their supporters, desire to resist Donald Trump, and that's all well and good. And maybe it is also sort of a reflection of that this growth in partisanship in Washington, sort of this march towards the Senate becoming like the House, but also, as Tara mentioned, sort of the danger this also comes to the Supreme Court, which has sort of been a more state environment, which because of that 60th vote threshold has been somewhat insulated from politics. Not that court decisions weren't political, but that there was always this extra, this barrier where that everyone on the court had to get through 60 votes, and that made it a lot harder for both parties to get sort of extreme justices on there. If that crumbles, so if the Democrats believe that's the inevitable march where this town is heading, then maybe now's the time to start fighting. But the question is, could they ever, if they were to, on Gorsuch, if they were to get some sort of 11th hour compromise, which I think is still possible, maybe Thursday night, Friday, certainly I think we're going to start hearing from the Republican lawmakers like John McCain, like people who are institutionalists, try to cut deals with some Democrats to see if they can pick them off. It'll be a tough move politically for them, but I think that's, in the next 72 hours, there is a potential to come back off of this cliff that we should all look at. It might be sort of the better thing for politics.
We'll look for that. I want to get both of your takes now on Jared Kushner. I mean, the man who does everything and has a new new job each and every week. Bruce Bartlett, who was a former advisor to Presidents Reagan and George H.W. Bush, writes this about Jared Kushner in the New York Times, quote, "If President Trump wishes Mr. Kushner to have such big responsibilities, he needs to give him a commensurate staff. That means moving people around, which will ruffle feathers and create bureaucratic enemies for him." What do you think of his assessment of what Jared Kushner needs to be successful, and also of how the president leans on him, trusts him to essentially be everywhere?
My feeling about Jared Kushner, and especially with this trip to Iraq, you're seeing that the Secretary of Defense is just trying to curry favor with the president via Jared Kushner. Everyone sees Jared Kushner as a person who has the ear of the president, and he's more of, Trump's way of being everywhere but not everywhere at the same time, so he can send Jared, and it's also his way of saying, it's Trump's way of kind of flouting the principles and the bureaucracy in the government and saying, I don't need to go through the decision-making process. I'm going to send Jared. We're going to talk over breakfast the next morning. He's going to tell me exactly what happened, and I don't need to go through the regular channels and cabinet secretaries. And he sent Jared to Iraq before even Rex Tillerson, the Secretary of State, made a visit. But, this is another way. If you want to get the president's ear, then you go through Jared, and you're even seeing it within the government. Mattis brought Jared on because he wants to get closer to the president.
Do you read it the same way? Is Jared there to listen and to be Donald Trump's ears in all of these rooms during all of these negotiations, or is the president, as he says he is, as Secretary Spicer says, leaning on his experience and things he's done already to bring a business sense to government?
I think it's a combination of both. I mean, certainly, the small staff that Jared Kushner has in the White House right now, people like Reed Cordish, Chris Liddell, who are sort of business-type people that they brought into sort of mostly for the reinventing government portfolio. The folks they're starting off looking at the VA, infrastructure, things like that. That's more in Jared Kushner's wheelhouse, if that is even in his wheelhouse. He's not, he's a neophyte at governing, and certainly at diplomacy, and he has the portfolios like Middle East peace and now Iraq. I mean, those are also not the sort of things that you sort of the portfolios you pick up if you're looking to sort of get an easy check mark at the end of the day, say look for the easy win. But I think that there's an element there where it's a symbolic move by the president, but also by these cabinet secretaries realizing that the president relies on Jared Kushner for things that are well outside of his portfolio. He values his advice. He values his role as sort of an independent arbiter, the person, one of the two people now in the White House who are there not, who can't really be fired and who are going to give him the best advice, and in his mind the best advice. So for him, if you're Tillerson, if you are the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, he's an important back channel for you.
I just am thinking that he probably is the son-in-law with the most amount of pressure on his shoulders in the world.
Can you imagine? Which is saying something,
right? Exactly.
Right.
On this topic of President Trump, obviously has a very small and close inner circle of people he trusts. I want to get back to this Washington Post story about a pre-inauguration meeting between a Trump donor, Eric Prince, who founded Blackwater, it's changed names since then, and an ally of Vladimir Putin, which was organized by the United Arab Emirates. One of the four reporters on that story, Greg Miller, spoke to us earlier. I just want you both to hear what he had to say.
I have to say we don't know the full agenda for this meeting in the Seychelles, but we were told that one important item for discussion is actually an area of shared interest between the Trump administration and the United Arab Emirates. Both see Iran as a threat, both see Iran as an adversary, an enemy, both really want to try to persuade Moscow to pull back, curtail its support to Iran. And this is something that the Trump team has really pursued and talked about throughout the transition period. How can they get Moscow to back away from Iran? What that means for Moscow is harder because Moscow does not have much interest in doing that. Iran is an important ally of Moscow in the Middle East, and so any overture by the United States would probably be met from Moscow by demands for a recognition of Russia's annexation of Crimea and lifting of U.S. sanctions.
And the Washington Post continues to do great work on the Russia angle of this. Where do you think this development fits into this broader web of connections between the president, his associates, and people aligned with the Kremlin?
I just think it's another day, another Russia story, another person in the circle, Trump circle, whether it's the inner circle, his own son-in-law who's going to testify before the Senate Intelligence Committee on his contacts with the Russian ambassador, and now a donor claiming to speak as a representative for the Trump organization. Whether they're all interconnected or not, there's definitely a message that's coming out of this administration that they are willing to do business with Russia and that they see them as a viable partner down the line. So it doesn't exactly it doesn't answer our questions about if they actually meddled in the election under the direction of the Trump administration, but it certainly creates an impression that the administration is a little too close to Russia.
I mean, I think in all of these Russia stories, I mean, we've seen a lot of smoke. We haven't seen the fire, which would, in that case would be any element of collusion. But there's the Trump administration has been very public about trying to find areas of common ground, of shared interest with the with Vladimir Putin, the Russian government, and that's partly where some of these questions have come up with, since particularly in the latter years of the Obama administration, they had become this great broad, geopolitical, geostrategic adversary. But a meeting like this alone, just sort of an interesting data point as a back channel, is the sort of thing that an incoming administration very well might do and could actually have sort of a positive benefit to what their agenda, what they're trying to do. There's a plausible explanation for this. The problem with with every Russia story, going back 6 months with the Trump campaign to the transition to the White House, has been that every time there's a plausible explanation and a reporter asks a question for it, they get defensive. And it's always been, this is in a lot of ways more of a communications problem for the White House than it is a policy problem. There's always a plausible explanation, a technical reason why a meeting like this, even General Flynn's phone call with the Russian ambassador, you can argue was technically defensible. The problem has always been the communication.
But the thing is, the location is also a little questionable. Out in the Indian Ocean, no press around. Why use a donor connected to a shady, security company? Blackwater obviously doesn't have the best reputation. Not to mention that his sister is Betsy DeVos, who is, the education secretary. It just seems a little shady to say, it almost makes for like a spy novel.
This is an administration that's been very upfront. The president's been very upfront that he's not going to tell us about what he's trying to do with foreign policy, and trying to keep adversaries around the world, ISIS and whatever. He's not going to tell us what the strategy is, what he's doing, and that creates an issue where when journalists do their jobs and report on these things, and they don't confirm them or sort of try to say, oh, that's not a big deal, or say that's not true. It creates a huge perception problem for the administration. I'm not, in a lot of ways, if they'd just come out and announced this meeting back in January, that would have been fine.
And it would have sucked a lot of the oxygen out. But I think, too, there is a perception problem, a reaction problem from the White House. But part of this is, I think, a calculation into what constituents who put Donald Trump in office want and care about. They've made the calculation that, and we'll show this story a bit later on, but Trump supporters, as passionate as they were at the rallies, are giving the president a lot of leeway, a lot of slack. They don't blame him personally for some of the negative stories, some of the government, that failure of the healthcare bill, for example. And I wonder, considering that, if you think that there may be a government shutdown. As we mentioned a short time ago, 7 D.C. working days left on the legislative calendar between now and April 28th. Do you expect a government shutdown over funding to take place, or do you think an agreement will be made on some of the key funding?
I think we're probably it's the highest likelihood outcome right now. I mean, that's not to say it's above 50%, but I put it like 30%. The question is, how do we get there? Is it
that the government will be funded?
I think 30% we shut down.
30% we shut down.
Just back of the envelope math. But I think the question is how do we get there? Do we get there because the president insists on cutting Planned Parenthood or the funding for the wall being there, or do Democrats or in the Senate block something over one of those provisions, or does the Freedom Caucus decide to defect because the CR that they come up with increases the deficit? There's so many different permutations of how we get there, but it's hard to see just a blanket straight up let's keep the government open type of bill happen right now, just given the dysfunction that we've seen both in the administration and in Congress.
Do you expect the Freedom Caucus then to be key in that fight? Because now you're at a point where Vice President Pence is over on Capitol Hill speaking to this group, which the president has publicly called out. Their constituents are telling them this is exactly what you wanted to do. It's a terrible bill. I
mean, there's an element of that too. I mean, they're certainly key in the House, and then but at the same time, whatever concession you give to the Freedom Caucus becomes an issue in the Senate. And here, like unlike the health care bill, where you can kick that one down, maybe you can cut a deal in 4 or 5 months.
Right.
I mean, there's that April 28th, April 29th deadline. That's hard, and there's nothing else they can do. So every concession they give on the right, they're going to have to pay for at that 60-vote threshold on the left.
I think that it's interesting to see the White House really courting the Freedom Caucus at this point behind the scenes, because publicly Trump, is trashing them on Twitter, blaming them, saying even his Dan Scavino, his digital secretary, basically saying that they should be primaried. But then behind the scenes, he's going golfing with Rand Paul. Right. He sends his vice president to go meet with this rogue group of 30 congressmen. They had a meeting tonight, and really behind the scenes, they're trying to make them feel really special and trying to get them on their side, but publicly saying, oh, we don't need you, we'll get the Democrats. And the Democrats say, the leadership says we haven't been contacted, even though they think they can pick off rank and file Democrats. Haven't heard anything of that, have you?
And if Democrats are willing to go nuclear in the Senate on a Supreme Court nominee, right. It's really hard to see them supplying votes for continuing resolution in the Senate in particular, and let alone the House, but certainly in the Senate, where we're talking about if that continuing resolution changes funding, it supports the president's priorities on building a border wall or cutting off funding for Planned Parenthood. Those become very big sticking points for Democrats anywhere. So, and they're already not inclined to give him a win.
So what the president tweets is one storyline. What actually happens here in Washington is different. It's great to have you both here to give us some of that insight. Zeke Miller with Time, and a CBSN political contributor, and Tara Palmeri with Politico, both White House correspondents. Thanks for coming in, guys.
Thanks.
Appreciate it.